My name is Dee Davis. I'm with National Transportation Consultants. As I said, I was with the state police in Indiana for 20 years in commercial vehicle enforcement. So if you've had drivers or trucks that have been pulled over by the damn DOT, it was somebody like me that did that. And there's a pretty good chance I was an instructor for the federal government as well as the state of Indiana. So if you're not from Indiana or haven't had trucks in Indiana, there's a good chance I trained whoever pulled over your trucks and wrote you up on everything. So for that, I apologize. But now I'm doing consulting work. As I told some folks at dinner last night, after 20 years with the state police, I decided to go to work for companies and protect them from my former coworkers and try to get some of the word out about the regulations. One of the things that the state and the federal government do a terrible job of is getting information about the regulations out to industry. They just assume that you would know it, that you would know where to go to find the information, and that you'd be able to make heads or tails of the regulations when you read them. How many of you actually spent any time reading the federal regulations, taking a look at those at all? Okay. If you have insomnia, highly recommend the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations by your nightstand. And the first thing I tell people, even when I taught classes to enforcement officers, the first thing I told them is don't expect any of this to make any sense. Somebody in Washington, D.C. thought this was a really good idea for truck safety. And the last time they were near a truck, it was metal and it was stamped Tonka, and that's about their extent with trucking. So some of these regulations, the intent of the regulations is to reduce crashes. That's the whole point. But some of these regulations, you read them and you'll think, you know, what in the world was this supposed to do? Other regulations you look at and you think, okay, that actually makes sense. From time to time, despite its best efforts, common sense does slip into the federal regulations. So that's what we're going to be talking about today for the most part. I'd like to thank Husqvarna for sponsoring our talk this morning as far as the DOT regulations are concerned. Again, I'm with the National Transportation Consultants. I want to talk about the federal regulations. Specifically, we want to start out with the definition of a commercial motor vehicle so we know what we're talking about when we talk about commercial motor vehicles. Touch base on the other regulations, spend a little time on hours of service, some of the recent changes and changes to the changes that came out from the federal government. That's one thing that you'll see quite a bit of. When we talk about the federal regulations, there's actually a manual. If you have one of the smaller pocket versions, that's called a driver manual. This is often referred to as a management edition. The biggest difference between the two are the small pocket versions don't have all of the regulations in them, whereas the larger size do. The other thing, when you look at the regulations, anytime that you would flip through the book, and of course now I wouldn't be able to find one as soon as I flip the book open to refer to it. But when you look at the regulations, one of the nice things they've done, they didn't used to do, is anytime you see the text, wow, I found the mic. Anytime you would see the text that's highlighted in gray in the regulations, those are interpretations to the regulations. These are administrative rulings, these are court rulings, and they affect how the regulation is applied. When I first joined the department in 1989, enforcement officers on the road did not have access to the interpretations. I only had access to the regulations. So it was not uncommon for me to stop a truck, do an inspection, write up violations, write tickets, and a week later get a call from headquarters. And they say, oh yeah, that company doesn't have to do that. Well, why not? Well, they have an exception. Oh, okay. Where's that at? Well, it's in the interpretations. Oh, okay, where do I find those? Oh, we have those. Where? In Indianapolis. Okay, I'm in Fort Wayne. How do I get a copy of those? Oh, you don't get a copy of those. So imagine your frustration as a trucking company. You know this regulation doesn't apply, but you've got a roadside officer, and trust me, at that point in time when I've got you pulled over, I've got the badge, I've got the red and blue lights, I got backup, I'm right. Okay? I don't care. Here's your ticket. Okay? You want to push this? I got handcuffs. So you as a company know you don't have to comply with this, and you've got this young whippersnapper telling you that, hey, you have a pink shirt on today. It's right here in the book. So that's one of the frustrating things about the regulations. Those regulations get updated 4 times a year, generally speaking. So if you buy a copy, even as the state, we only bought 1 copy a year, but every year we'd buy a new handbook for all our officers. But if you have access to the internet, you can go to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's website, and you can access the regulations there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for free. And it's going to be, generally speaking, the most up-to-date copy of the regulations you're going to be able to find. So it's an excellent resource for you to use. The other book that people don't hear about as much is the out-of-service criteria. And that's this little book that's put out by the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. Basically what happens is on a roadside inspection, we're going to look in the book and see if anything you're doing is in there. And then we're going to look for those things and see if they're in here. So if you have a violation that's in this book, your driver's out of service or your truck is out of service, which means either one of them cannot operate until that condition is taken care of. When I talk about driver qualification, I'm going to tell you that drivers, generally speaking, have to be 21 years old to operate in interstate commerce. So not being 21 is an out of service violation. So if I stop you and you're 19 in interstate commerce, you know how long you're out of service? 2 years. Got to sit there at the scales for 2 years. It's terrible. Actually, we're going to let that driver go, but that violation has to be taken care of. Most people don't know about this particular book. The regulations you can get, the management edition for $10 to $12 from J.J. Keller, Labor Master, a couple of different companies. The only place you can get out of service criteria is from the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. And the version that I have in my hand right now, laminated with pictures in the back, is $45. So for non-members. Now to be a member, I think it's $800 a year, and you save $10 on the CVSA book. You do the math as far as whether that's going to be a worthwhile investment for you or not. But I'm going to pass this around so you can take a look at it. The majority of the book is information about the Canadian regulations, Canadian licenses for officers that don't deal with that. But probably about that much of it is actual driver out of service violations and vehicle out of service violations. So just have an idea what's going on with that. We're going to talk about the operational impact of these regulations. What's going to happen when you get pulled over? They do an inspection, how that's going to work through the system. And when we talk about operational impact, one of the things we're going to spend some time on is the CSA program, Compliance, Safety, and Accountability, originally called CSA 2010. Now we just call that CSA because in 2008, CSA 2010 sounded really cool. Okay. In 2013, it might as well be CSA 1974. Okay. It's not quite as cool, so we dropped that. And then I want to talk a little bit about DOT audits. You hear about DOT audits, compliance reviews, safety audits, things that can be triggered by your CSA score. And so we'll talk about a little bit about those, and of course I'll open it up for any questions. Okay. So far so good? Ready to go for the ride? All right. I'll try not to yak you into a coma, but it's federal regulations. I've only got so much I can do. First thing and the most important things we need to talk about is who these regulations apply to, applicability. And right out of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, they apply to all employers, to all employees, and all commercial motor vehicles transporting property or passengers in interstate commerce. Okay. So it employs to you if you own the company and you're putting the trucks out on the road. It applies to your drivers. They're going to be held subject, and the vehicles themselves. Now that doesn't mean that if the driver's doing something wrong that you don't get in trouble for it if you told him not to do it. Okay? As far as the government's concerned, you put him out there on the road, you're still liable for his actions. But they can, and they have in the past, held drivers liable. They've actually issued specific stand-down orders for specific drivers, saying they pose an imminent threat to the public. And it doesn't happen very often, but they have come in and said, literally said, you as a driver, you will not drive, and take a guy off the road. It's more often that they do it to companies, but they can do that to drivers as well. So when we talk about a commercial motor vehicle, because that's the key, what is a commercial motor vehicle? We're going to delve into Part 390.5 of the Federal Regulations, and we come up with a definition, again, transporting property or passengers in interstate commerce to further a commercial enterprise, trying to make money. That's one of the things I used to get all the time, pull a guy over and he said, well, I'm not making any money. So, but you're trying. Okay? And the IRS appreciates you trying, so we're going to stomp you down because who do you think you, so commercial motor vehicle. Commercial motor vehicle kicks in at 10,000 pounds, gross vehicle weight rating, gross combination weight rating, or actual weight. So gross vehicle weight rating is simply you pop open the door in your truck, you look at the VIN plate, and there's going to be a gross vehicle weight rating inside of that door. If you've got a half-ton pickup truck, it's probably somewhere in the ballpark of 6,500 pounds, depending on your suspension and your brakes. Okay? Get a 1-ton dually, you're looking probably around 11,000 to 12,000 pounds, depending on the truck. Gross combination weight rating means your truck pulling anything, pulling a trailer, pulling a compressor, or whatnot. Okay? So if I have a truck, my half-ton pickup truck with a gross vehicle weight rating of 6,500 pounds, I'm under 10,000. So I'm not subject to the regulations. But now I hook on a trailer. Let's say I hook on a 4,000-pound trailer, and I've got that 6,500-pound truck. Now my gross combination weight rating is 10,500, and I just put myself in all the DOT regulations. Okay. And then actual weight. used to be, back in the day, you could buy a truck rated for exactly 10,000 pounds. And as long as it was rated for 10,000, it didn't matter how much it weighed. You weren't subject to the regulations. So what did people do? Well, I'd go out and buy a truck rated for 10,000, load it up at 20, drive down the road, kind of like that log truck in the picture earlier. The problem is, of course, the brakes failed, the frame would break. They'd have all kinds of crashes. And the federal government said the only reason people are buying these trucks and doing this is to get away with not complying with the safety regulations. So then they put in actual weight. So if your truck or trailer combination actually weighs more than 10,000 pounds, that's going to put you into this definition. Okay, 10,000 pound is the entry level for everything except CDL licenses and drug testing. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. Okay? But otherwise, everything's 10,000 pounds. The other thing, if you transport passengers, I realize you guys are in the logging industry, but if you transport passengers, either for hire or privately, that can put you into the regulations. And then last but not least, if you transport hazardous materials that require placarding. Okay? There are materials out there the federal government has determined are so dangerous that any amount of that placardable or that material would require to be placarded. Nitroglycerin would be an example. Radioactive yellow 3, you're dangerous when wet commodities. You have a teaspoon of those materials on your truck, you have to have placards on all 4 sides. And if you have to have placards, that pulls you into the regulations. So sometimes you'll see these home health vehicles, it might even be a car, and you'll see oxygen placards on all 4 sides. It's because they're carrying enough oxygen in that car to get them over 1,000 pounds of material, and they're subject, that's a commercial motor vehicle. Yeah, in my Prius, cruising down the street with my logbook ruler. You guys are all going to want logbook rulers by the time I'm done. I'm going to really push those because I don't want to take them home. So we talked about the definition of a commercial motor vehicle being over 10,000 pounds. Here we have a nice big log truck, oddly enough, with an enforcement car sitting on a cat scale. There's a story behind that picture, but I won't go into it right now. But just a glance, would you think that's a commercial motor vehicle? Yeah. Because when you think of commercial motor vehicle, what do you think? You're thinking big 18-wheeler, right? There's a buddy of mine used to say, bends in the middle. Okay? Commercial motor vehicle. What about this truck? Would you automatically think that that's a commercial motor vehicle? Are there any of you in here that would think, before I told you about the 10,000 pounds and the gross vehicle weight rating, would it ever occurred to you that that truck could be a commercial motor vehicle? Some of you might notice that there's actually a trailer attached to that truck, but I cropped the picture because I didn't want you to think about the trailer. But that truck right there, if it was a 3/4 ton dually, it might not be a commercial motor vehicle by gross vehicle weight rating. But if it's a 1 ton dually, I can just about guarantee it's going to be over 10,000 pounds of gross vehicle weight rating. So you're going out to the job site, you got your chainsaw in the back and your chainsaw chaps and some oil and whatnot, and just run it out to maybe take the guy's lunch, go out and check on them, and that's over 10,000, you're using that in the business, that's a commercial motor vehicle. It's going to be subject to all the regulations. Okay. Now I keep saying subject to all the regulations. Bear in mind that there are exceptions throughout the regulations. And anytime you would read a regulation where it says there are no exceptions, the next regulation will be exemptions. Okay, there are exceptions to all kinds of stuff. So, and if you hear me saying generally speaking, that's a pretty good indication that somebody somewhere gets exempted for that particular rule. So it's not always a hard and fast thing. So the FMCSR, the green book that we're talking about, we break down into 390, which is general definitions. We're going to talk about insurance, accident registers, things that are broken down in general. 391 is driver qualification. We're going to get into that a little bit, what you have to be considered a qualified driver. We're going to talk about the actual driving of a commercial motor vehicle in 392. We're going to talk about equipment in 393. We're going to talk about hours of service, everybody's favorite. Logbooks, time cards, whatnot. Exceptions, exceptions, exceptions. And we're going to talk about maintenance under Part 396. Yes, believe it or not, you have to do maintenance on your vehicles and inspect them and all that good stuff. I know, federal government being such a pain, having to have brakes when you drive down the road. So overrated. One of the things the federal government requires you to have is you have to have insurance on file if you're a for-hire carrier. A private carrier is not required to have insurance on file with the federal government. But if you're a private carrier, as part of getting your ICC number or your MC number, depending on when you became a for-hire carrier, you have to file with the federal government that you have at least $750,000 of insurance. If you haul passengers, if you haul hazardous materials, you can get in up to $5 million on your insurance requirements. But that's a form that has to be filed with the federal government, and then then you have to have a copy on file in your office. So if you're for hire, if you do contract work, if you go out and haul logs for other people, then you would have to have this MCS 90 form because you're a for hire carrier. If you are a logging company and you haul your own logs and haul your own equipment, then at that point in time you would not have to have this form because you're not a for hire carrier, you're a private carrier. Okay? See what happens. We have to mark our commercial motor vehicles. Under Part 390, we have to have the name of the company, and we have to have the DOT number on both sides of the commercial motor vehicle. Has to be clearly legible on normal lighting conditions when the vehicle stopped at 50 feet. Used to get phone calls, and I still do, how big do my letters have to be on my truck? Used to be 2 inches. So it had to be at least 2 inches high. The problem is graphics have far surpassed the regulations. So if I have a nice Arial bold graphic, that's the text that I use, and I make my signs and lettering on my truck, 2 inches would be fine. If I use French Garamond script, look that up in Windows, and I do that in 2-inch letters, nobody on the planet is going to be able to read it. So what they basically said is I have to be able to read that from 50 feet when the vehicle is stationary, normal lighting conditions. I have to have name, DOT number, both sides of the truck. Okay? I can have additional information. I can have my phone number. I can have my city and state. I can have my ICC number, my MC number, depending on what I have, as long as it belongs to my company. But the two things I have to have are going to be my name and my DOT number. Okay? 390 includes definitions. We talked about the definition of a commercial motor vehicle. That's where we find that. We're going to find the definition of accident. We're going to find the definition of interstate and intrastate, certain farm vehicle driver. All kinds of definitions in 390.5 that we're going to use throughout the regulations. We're also going to find where they refer to accident registers. An accident register basically is if you have a crash that is considered recordable by the federal government, you have to have an accident register on file for that year. So if in 2013 you have a truck that's in a crash that's recordable, then you have to have this form filled out. This is a real simple form. And one of the things when we talk about federal forms, oftentimes in the regulations it'll say this is the information the form has to have, but there's no official form. That's simply something I did on Excel when I did safety audits for the state, and I'd go into companies and I'd say, do you have a copy of an accident register? No, we need one. Here's a free one. Don't pay anybody any money for it. Real simple, basic information. So a lot of things in the regulations are like that. There's no official form. There's simply, you have to have all the collected information on that form. You can do that yourself. Now you may be wondering, you keep talking about a recordable crash. What, pray tell, is a recordable crash? The easiest way to remember what a recordable crash is for the federal government is it involves one of your commercial motor vehicles, and the crash involves nurse, hearse, or tow. Okay? Anyone that's injured and has to seek immediate medical treatment away from the scene, nurse. Anyone in the crash is killed, taken away in a hearse, or any disabling damage to any vehicle involved in the crash that requires to be towed from the scene. Nurse, hearse, tow. If it meets one of those three things, it's a recordable crash. You'll notice that I did not say anything about fault, okay? Because at this point in time, the federal government is not concerned with fault. They're simply concerned that you had a truck involved in this crash and you have to have this accident register. Okay? At a later date, they will look at preventability and when they're building a crash rate for your company. But at this point in time, it's simply that you were involved in the crash and they want to collect data on that crash. Okay? So nurse, hearse, or tow. Write that down. Get a tattoo. If anybody in here gets a tattoo of nurse, hearse, or tow, we need to talk. Last but not least, under Part 390 is relief from emergencies, or relief for emergencies. And in the logging industry, you're actually in kind of a unique situation because when you have, we talked about Hurricane Hugo, talked about Hurricane Sandy. What are the two things that are big runs on after every major environmental catastrophe? Generators and chainsaws. Okay, that's one of those things. Every time there's a tornado in Indiana, within an hour of the tornado, there are guys with pickup trucks with generators and chainsaws coming down their line. That was one of the things that the state police we did. They were just coming in to make money, and so we would take them behind a barn usually and beat them severely. And no, wait, I wasn't supposed to tell you that. But that's what people are looking for. They're looking for chainsaws. What the federal government can do, or a state governor, even a regional, like a mayor at that point in time, they can declare an emergency in that area. And if you are providing direct relief to that emergency, you are exempt from almost all of the regulations. Now, sometimes they'll narrow it down, especially in the winter for propane deliveries. But generally speaking, after a major tornado, earthquake, hurricane, if you're bringing in water, chainsaws, equipment, at that point in time, you're going to be exempt from the regulations. And that's provided for in Part 390. Hurricane Katrina probably being the biggest thing and the longest lasting exemption. Those exemptions went on for almost a year after Hurricane Katrina because of direct relief, because we had to get several thousand extra trailers down there that we didn't need, and several thousand tons of ice that needed to melt. So we had to allow them to do that without complying with any safety regulations, because I love the federal government, I really do. Part 391 is driver qualification. And I mentioned earlier you have to be 21. There are minimum standards for the drivers, and we'll touch base on those here in a second. But the idea is we don't just throw anybody behind the wheel of a truck. Okay? Don't just throw anybody into the trucks. We want to make sure they've got some qualifications. We want to make sure that they're physically qualified. There's actually some changes coming up with physical qualification regulations that are going to take place in January and May of next year. So we'll touch on those here in just a second. You want to look at the safety history of that employee. The previous employers, if they've had them where they operated a commercial motor vehicle, you want to find out about that safety history. Were they involved in any crashes? Things that are going to be an indication to you that they might be a problem. They were a problem for the previous employer, and they may very well be a problem for you. And you have to make a decision whether you want to put them behind the wheels of one of your trucks or not. But again, we were talking about liability with insurance. These are things that are going to impact that. 5 years down the road, you take a chance on a guy and he turns out to be really good, and hey, that was worthwhile. But you take a chance on another guy and 6 months down the road, it may be clear cut that you need to get rid of him. Okay? So and when we talk about the driver qualification, one of those things is doing annual reviews of those drivers. Do I need to be keeping this guy? Is he causing me more problems than he's worth? Okay? We have to keep files. Not only do we have to make sure the driver's qualified, we have to keep a file to prove that he's qualified, because we're dealing with the government. And what's the government want to see? Paperwork. No work is done until the paperwork's done. It can be argued that the federal government is the biggest boon to the pulpwood industry known to man. Just throwing that out there. It's kind of a love-hate, give and take relationship. And then, like I mentioned, that annual certification paper is part of that driver qualification process. We have to make sure that the guy has a good license and he's still safe to drive. And we're going to review that on an annual basis every 12 months. We're going to make sure that they're a good driver, that we want to keep them. How many of you have had a driver that within a month or 2 months of bringing them on, somebody that you thought was going to be a good driver, not working out at all? Experienced that? Nobody? Nobody's ever had that happen? Wow. How many people are awake again? Just a quick check, because biggest group of liars ever met in my life. Driver requirements. Some of the specific things have to be. Generally speaking, there it goes. Generally speaking, you have to be 21 years of age. There are circumstances where you don't necessarily have to be 21 to operate interstate commerce. But generally speaking, if you're going to cross state lines, you have to be 21. Most states, if you're going to operate within the state, you only have to be 18 to operate a commercial motor vehicle. Okay? But to actually cross state lines, you've got to be 21. You have to be able to read and speak English. When I do training for the Teamsters, when I get to this point, they all start laughing. One of the things you need to keep in mind when we talk about being able to read and speak English, and that, by the way, is an out-of-service violation. If you cannot speak English sufficiently to communicate with a law enforcement officer, the officer will take you out of the truck. They're not going to let you drive anymore. And they have to order Rosetta Stone and have it delivered to the scales. Have to be able to safely operate a commercial motor vehicle. Kind of a no-brainer, right? We want them to know what the world they're doing when they're driving our truck. Now, if they're a CDL licensed driver, we can accept their CDL license as proof of a road test, because since 1992, you've actually had to drive the truck to get the license. Otherwise, we have to put them through a road test, make sure they can actually safely operate the vehicle, and we have to keep paperwork for that on file. Make sure they're physically qualified. This is their medical examiner certificate, or their medical card that you hear about. They have to go in for a physical generally every 2 years, and just have basic health conditions, not have any issues with diabetes or high blood pressure, which can actually shorten the length of a medical card, or other conditions that would be considered a high risk to lose control of a commercial motor vehicle. They're not out to get anybody. I know a lot of guys personally that became diabetic and went fought going on insulin for a long time because they knew they wouldn't be able to drive after that. Because you're an insulin-dependent diabetic, unless you get into a waiver program, you can't drive a commercial motor vehicle. As with technology, the medications have changed. They review things periodically. That's why the diabetic waiver program is actually even open. So we get some changes in the long-acting insulin where you don't have the highs and the lows. So they do review these things. They do look at them. But again, when they're looking at, do we take a chance on you and you kill some people, or we don't let you drive, 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, we're not going to let you drive. So they're going to be very strict on that. Have to have a valid license. Who'd have thought, right? But we put that in the regulations. Got to have a valid license. Might not be a CDL license, because remember I said CDL kicks in at a different level. So you might have, depending on your home state, Indiana still has a chauffeur's license on the books. So you might have to have a chauffeur's license, or you might have an operator's license and be able to operate a commercial motor vehicle. It's just going to depend on the gross vehicle weight rating and what you're hauling. And then every year you have to provide a list of convictions for moving violations to your employer. And that's part of that annual paperwork for you as an employer. You have to review that information the driver tells you, and then you also have to run their driver's license and make sure that they're telling you everything that they've been convicted of. I know you find it hard to believe that a driver might not tell you about a conviction, might hide information from you. It can happen. Okay, it is possible. Again, how many people are awake? Just a quick check. Okay. Because that was remotely funny, just a little. So there were some changes coming from a medical examiner certificate. Actually, if you're a CDL license holder, you're probably experiencing some of this now. States are doing self-certification for drivers. In other words, they're asking them, are you exempt, or do you have to have a medical card? If you have to have a medical card as of January 30th, 2014, your medical examiner certificate will have to be submitted to your home state, and it will become part of your CDL license. They are going to require you to carry your medical card for the first 15 days after you submit your medical card to the state. I would recommend carrying it longer, because Indiana was a pilot state for this program. And basically what it boils down to is when you get pulled over on the side of the road, you hand me your CDL license. I run that as an officer. It comes back valid. That tells me you have a valid medical card on file. You would not have to have separate paperwork at that point in time. Okay. That's been part of the Mexican CDL since the Mexican CDL came in '92. It's been part of the Canadian driver's license forever. It's 2013, and now you can see United States, we're finally getting to that point that in 2014, if you have a CDL license, your license will be your medical card. If you don't have a CDL, then at that point in time, you would still have to carry your medical card on your possession. Okay, still have to have that with you, but they're in the process of going through that. If you have a driver that has a skills performance evaluation certificate, what they used to call a medical waiver. That means they have a physical injury, where they've had a loss of hand or foot, or an impairment of the eye, where they've had to go through a process to get a waiver to be able to drive. They'll still have to carry that waiver paperwork with them. It's just the medical card itself that will be part of their driver's license. Okay. And then in the driver qualification file, one of the things you have to keep is the medical card. But if one of the things the states are required to do as part of your driver's license record, as a CDL licensed driver, it will indicate your medical status on that record. And so if that is the case, then the company doesn't have to have a separate copy of the medical card at that point in time. So a little bit of paperwork relief as well. Now the other big change, and this is going to affect everybody that has to have a medical card, which is everybody that's not exempt from the regulations, is the federal government has decided that while they let pretty much anybody be a medical examiner up until this point, obviously there were problems with training levels and knowledge levels. Any of you have your medical, anybody here have a medical card and have it on them at this point in time? If you look at a medical card, there's actually a checkbox that says qualified under 391.64. And that's actually the diabetic and vision waiver program. And what we've seen a lot of is medical examiners that aren't familiar with the paperwork, and they're filling it out, and they get to the card itself, and they're thinking, well, this guy's qualified. I got to check one of these boxes. Oh, here, qualified. They check that. Well, to a roadside inspector, that means that driver has to have additional paperwork or he's out of service. So the first time the driver finds out is when the officer says, where's your medical waiver? And the guy says, my what? Get out of the truck, sir. Doesn't go well after that. So they said, we need to train these guys. We need to make sure these people know what they're doing. So they came up with the National Registry of Certified Medical Examiners. To be in this database, you actually have to go through certification with the federal government. There's continuing education as you continue to be a medical examiner. You can't just get in there and be certified and be done for the rest of your life. And as of May 21st of next year, If you get a medical exam, it has to be done by one of the examiners listed in this database. And as a carrier, you need to be checking that. And as an enforcement officer or the federal government, they're going to be getting that stuff electronically from those medical examiners. So it's make it more difficult to doctor shop. And then you see that a lot. I go to one doctor, my blood pressure was up that day, he won't give me my medical card, so I go home and I take all my blood pressure medication I haven't been taking, get my blood pressure down, go to a different doctor. I don't tell him I have high blood pressure, he thinks everything's cool, and he gives me a two-year medical card. So this is one of the things they're trying to prevent as well. Obviously it makes sense, we don't want people out there driving when it's not safe for them to drive and it's not safe for the general public for them to drive. But that's a big change coming in May 21st. The drawback I see at this point in time is there's probably going to be a shortage of drivers because a lot of personal doctors and family doctors are not wanting to mess with this database, not wanting to mess with the training, and so they're not doing it. So you're going to probably see a drop in the number of doctors available to do these exams, probably see some wait times, probably see some prices go up. Eventually it'll work itself out, but it's not going to be pretty. So what I've been telling people, if your medical card expires in 2014 and it expires after May 21st, I know by May 20th, I would be going to get my new medical card. That's going to give me a year to 2 years to let this mess work itself out and things even out before I have to deal with getting another medical card. Okay. That's the website, nrcme.fmcsa.dot.gov. There's no www in front of that. Okay. And that's the website you can go to. You can do a search by state. I think you can do a search by zip code. Until last month, I live out of the Fort Wayne region of the state of Indiana. It's the northeast corner if you're familiar with Indiana, and there were no doctors in that area listed. There are now 2. There are 2. There can be some busy men. They're going to be working a lot of weekends. Part 392, everybody get that website that needed it? Doing it. Part 392, we talk about driving. And it breaks down into 2 different things. First of all, things that you're required to do. Okay? You are required to wear your seatbelt when you're driving a commercial motor vehicle. Okay? There's nothing in the regulations about the passenger riding shotgun wearing their seatbelt. Only the driver. Why do you think that is? Do we not like passengers? Do we not care about them? If you watch the public service announcements, what's the purpose of a seatbelt? Oh, come on. Seatbelts save lives, right? We want to save you because we're concerned about you. We're the Kindler General Federal Motor Carrier Administration. We really like you, and we want to protect you. Okay, we want to see that you go home at night. Here's the reality. If you are not behind the controls of that commercial motor vehicle, what good are you to anybody? Okay? If you're seatbelted in and things go south, can you steer the truck? Can you hit the brakes? Do we have ABS brakes now on trucks now, the newer trucks? Yeah, and ABS allows you to hit the brakes as hard as you can and not lock them up and be able to steer around things, reduce the damage of that collision. Okay? That's the point. We want to keep you behind the controls because you're a professional driver and you need to stay there so you can get that vehicle stopped and avoid further collision or further damage. If we saved your life at the same point, that's awesome. Okay, because we really don't want to see anybody hurt. But if you can control that vehicle and reduce the impact of that crash, that's what we want. If you're laying on the floor of the cab doing your impression of a dying cockroach with your legs and your arms waved in the air, you're no good to anybody at that point in time. Okay? That's why they don't specifically address the passenger. It's not that we don't care about the passenger, but the passenger's not going to be able to steer or do anything else. They can flop around the cab all they want. Okay? Driver, we want you in the seat. Okay? You're never going to see that in a public service announcement. You get that from the state police. Yeah, you can slide down the pavement. You stay behind the control of the driver. So you got to wear your seatbelt. You got to do your pre-trip inspection, and Jerry mentioned that in the insurance. Pre-trip inspection is one of the best things you can do to reduce violations on roadside inspections, reduce fines and reduce breakdowns. If you can get your guys to go out and actually do a pre-trip inspection, and that does not mean they walk to the back of the trailer, pee, and walk back up to the truck, okay? That's your roadside periodic inspection for your over-the-road driver, okay? I'm not going to the truck stop, takes too long, I'm going to go back here and urinate behind my trailer, and I'm going to call that my pre-trip, okay? They do it all the time. You get them to do that pre-trip, run through the lights, do the walk around, check the tires. You know, look at these things. If you can get them fixed before you take off, how much is a tire? $300 for a semi-tractor, that ballpark? Mounting and balancing and all that stuff. And if you can get the Goodyear truck out to your yard, or if you've got a mechanic where you can do that in the yard and get that tire swapped out, it's going to be a whole lot cheaper than the side of the road. Because on the side of the road, that $300 tire is going to be $600 to $900. Okay? I used to joke that I was going to retire and open up a roadside repair service because of the how much money they were making just on the parts and the service charge and the mileage and the fuel surcharge. So if your guys are doing a good pre-trip inspection, and there's no paperwork involved for the pre-trip, it's the end of the day that they do the paperwork. But first thing in the morning, they want to do a good pre-trip inspection. And we need to make sure we have our emergency equipment. Anybody know right off the top of their head what the emergency equipment is? There are 3 things specifically we're looking for. Fire extinguisher? Pardon? Triangles? Triangles? You could have, could you have flares? Is that still legal to have flares? It is actually. You can still have flares. Triangles are better. If you had a flammable load, you couldn't have flares. But triangles are better because the triangles, while they can get run over, won't burn out 20 to 30 minutes after you break down. And the regulations require that you have emergency devices out the entire time that you're broke down. So if you have 3 flares during an inspection, that officer has no idea whether you're going to be broke down longer than 20 or 30 minutes. So he's going to pass you. But then you break down, you light your 3 flares, you put those out, 45 minutes later, somebody comes along that's not paying attention, drunk, tired, whatever, and they slam into your truck. Who's in violation of the Federal Motor Safety Regulations at that point? You are. It's your fault. Okay? You were sitting there minding your own business, but now it's your fault. You're involved in this because you should have had something else. So your triangles are going to be better at that point in time. And a note on triangles, how far back should they be? Say on like a 4-lane divided highway. And I don't mean how far you actually see them, okay? Because you actually see them, because it's actually 10, 100, and 100. So you're actually, that last one should be about 200 feet away from the trailer, but what you actually get is 10, 15, and 18. Because the driver starts out and he's all fired up, and I'm gonna get these out there, and there's that first one. Whew, I'm getting farther away from the truck. It's getting really hot, tell with this. And they're done, okay? And they should divert traffic away from the truck, not in towards it. I've seen that, And then for a new driver, I would highly recommend that you conduct Triangle Assembly 101. They usually get the part where it unfolds. It's like a transformer. Okay, so they get that part where it unfolds. It's the twisting it on the base that seems to throw them. You know how many times I pull up behind a truck and all the triangles are down and the kid's out there and it's windy. You're like, I can get these things to stand up. Let me show you something really cool. What a deal. Okay, what a deal. So yeah, so we have to have triangles, we have to have fire extinguishers. Heard somebody mention first aid kit. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations actually doesn't require a first aid kit in a truck. I have seen some people interpret the OSHA regulations to mean that say that the truck would have to have a first aid kit. If you want to put one in there, you're not going to get in trouble with the DOT. But there's one other thing that I haven't heard. Anybody? Spare fuses. You have to have spare fuses for the type that your truck uses. Okay? Now, if your truck uses 3 30-amp fuses, you don't have to have 3 for 30-amp fuses. You just have to have 1 30-amp fuse. The idea being if you have a fuse blow and you can swap out a fuse, you get your lights going, you still go down the road safely. Okay? When I first became an inspector, my first couple years on the department, my job was to find stuff wrong with your truck. So if I couldn't find stuff wrong with your truck, I had failed. I had to find something wrong with your truck. That was my holdout violation. It was the very last thing. If I could find nothing else wrong with your truck, I'd ask the driver, do you have spare fuses? What? Yes. Need to get spare fuses in that truck, sir? Here's a warning. Okay? Gotta have spare fuses. So those are things that you have to do. Things that you're not supposed to do. Okay? The biggest thing is you're not supposed to use your cell phone and handheld cell phone use or texting. Okay? And the way they've defined driving for these 2 new regulations, driving includes temporary stops because of traffic or traffic control devices, which means you pull up to a red light and you're going to send that quick text, you are in violation of federal regulations. The only time you can be at the controls of a commercial motor vehicle and legally text or use handheld cell phone use is if you're contacting emergency services because of a drunk or a crash or whatever, or if you've pulled completely off the roadway and the vehicle is parked. Okay? Otherwise, if you're sitting at a light, checking your text real quick, okay? Handheld cell phone use. I was talking to a buddy of mine still with the state police. He used the term shooting fish in a barrel for cell phone use at this point in time. He said because they'll have a handheld or they'll have a wireless and the battery will go dead and they don't want to give up on that conversation or whatever, so then they just pick up the phone. And he said when you're driving down the road like this a truck, it's pretty easy to see coming down the road. And I said, what are they give you an excuse? And he said, yeah, usually they're using their GPS. Because I know when I use my GPS, I hold it to my ear. Because when you're on the road a lot, you get a little lonely, you know, and you like talking to the GPS. Because the GPS never calls you names or badmouths you, so that's how I do it. Alcohol and drugs, okay, prohibited. Okay? The only time you can have alcohol in a commercial motor vehicle is if you're driving a bus and it's in the passenger compartment, okay, which I find very interesting. The passenger compartment is anything behind the driver. Okay. If you're in a property carrier, if you're in a semi-tractor trailer, and you have a can of beer in the trailer, 75 feet away from you in the cab that you can't reach or nobody can hand to you, you're in violation. If you've got a bunch of Cubs fans behind you and they're all drinking because, well, they're Cubs fans, and the guy behind you has a beer and he can literally hand it to you while you're driving, that's legal. Not that he hands it to you, but that the beer is that close to you as a driver. One of those things in the regulations. Or if it's a manifested part of the load. If you work for Jim Beam Distilleries and you're hauling Jim Beam whiskey down the road, manifested in the trailer, that's legal. Otherwise, for alcohol and drugs, alcohol obviously is not legal. Drugs, if you have a prescription medication and the medical examiner that prescribed that medication has assured you it will not affect your ability to safely operate a commercial motor vehicle, then you can have that prescription med in your possession. Okay? And you would want to keep it in that prescription bottle. Can't have a radar detector in a commercial motor vehicle. Okay? Radar detector is used for one thing, detecting radar. Okay? And the police have those. And yeah, I'm believing for a minute that you have electric socks. Actually, the driver, he grabbed the radar detector off his dash, stuck it down in the boot, in his boot. So there's the wire going from the plug in the dash into his boot. So what's that to? He said, oh, I got electric socks to keep my feet warm. I said, man, it's July, you know. I might have bought that in December, but yeah, hey, it's worth a try. Yeah, it's worth a try. Can't have a radar detector. Can't have unauthorized passengers. And that doesn't mean that your coworker that you don't like can't ride in the truck with you. Okay? Unauthorized passengers, what they're talking about here is picking up hitchhikers. Okay? They don't want any distractions in the cab. You can transport employees of the company. That's always legal. You can actually get permission to have somebody ride with you if the company gives that to you in writing. Okay? But here's one of the crazy things: is a particular instance, the regulation is kind of nuts. The company has to give you permission in writing to have that person with you, but they don't have to retain a copy of that permission, and you don't have to carry a copy of that permission. I see no possibility for that being abused in any way, shape, or form.
Is it okay to have a dog in?
As long as the company allows it, yeah. There's nothing in the federal regulations that would prevent you from having a dog. Some companies won't, because especially depending on the size of the dog and dog running around and distracting the driver. But yeah, that's I've seen dogs, cats, cockatiels, a python, a spider monkey. Yeah, you name it. I've seen other stuff too, but they weren't animals. They were. And I'm not going there because it took a couple years of therapy to get past that. So you can have a passenger, they just have to be authorized. Okay. Last but not least, you can't drive while you're ill or fatigued. Okay. This is gained some attention when Minnesota had a fatigue checklist that they were enforcing. They actually got sued by the Owner-Operators Independent Drivers Association. They agreed to stop using the checklist. But the idea behind this is if the driver is so ill or fatigued that they can no longer safely operate a commercial motor vehicle. And when we get sick, because we're Americans and we'll sleep when we're dead, right? I mean, that's just kind of, we're Americans. That's what we do. We get sick, we keep pushing ourselves. We keep pushing ourselves. And you all know those people that come in, they're sick as a dog, and they will not stay home. Okay? And they're making everybody else sick, but they don't want to use their sick time or for whatever reason. Or maybe they're just really dedicated. But it gets to a point where they cannot safely operate the commercial motor vehicle because their reaction time is down. Okay? And so at that point in time, that can be something that's actually not a service violation as well. You can actually take somebody out of a truck if they're so sick or so fatigued. And as I tell people, ill and fatigued does not mean you're sick and tired of working. Okay? So I'm not coming in today. I'm sick and tired of working. Okay? I can't drive, violation of federal regulations. Okay? Yeah. So just keep that in mind. How many of you, and I'm sure you have, I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands because you're all asleep, but you found yourself in a situation where you didn't realize how bad you felt until you got better. Okay? And you're looking back and you're thinking, man, I was working, I was operating that piece of equipment. I shouldn't have been doing that. But, if we all had common sense, it wouldn't be. Of course, common sense is not as common as the name would imply. Okay? We've all done stupid things. So that's one of those things that they can put you out of service for. The big one, cell phone and texting. Texting came in 2011. Cell phone handheld use came in 2012. If you have a hands-free device, that is acceptable. Okay, that is acceptable. It's the handheld use. And when you think about it, now here's the fun thing. If you have a two-way radio, an actual two-way radio that does not use the cellular tower network, like a push-to-talk, you can talk on that. You can hold that in your hand. You can try that holding your CB mic in your hand. So let's talk about equipment. Just going to run through the equipment pretty quickly. Pretty common stuff. Obviously brakes. These are all pictures that I've taken from my career. No problem there, right? Going to have minimum safe distance, not a problem, not a problem. Actually, the good news was the brake lining quit wearing. They were getting a lot of miles out of those brake linings. Okay. It's a cost-saving measure. Lights got to work. Okay. One of the things that they've over the years, this has waffled back and forth a couple times, and as it stands right now, the only lights that are required to work are the lights that are required on the truck. Now there is a vehicle maintenance general where if you have other lights on there, a lot of guys call them chicken lights. They'll put all the extra marker lights on the trucks. That officers will write you up for those lights not working. They'll put that under vehicle maintenance general. There's one of the lighting thing. But generally what the government's looking for, you gotta have your turn signals, headlights, low beams, high beams, the things that you have to have. So what they're literally looking for. If you wanna have a little fun, you ever get a chance to be at a scale house and one of those guys with all the chicken lights is coming in, like 300 lights on his truck, throw the red light, walk out and say, you got a marker light burned out. And just see what his reaction is. Tires. They have to be more than just rounded and inflated. They have to have tread. Okay. Looking for cord exposed. Again, if you didn't catch that in your pre-trip, again, that was just a bathroom break for you. That was not actually a pre-trip inspection. I kicked those tires. Did you really? Okay. Was that last year? In a dream? Yeah, that was. Steering. We're going to be looking at the drag links, the output shafts, steering wheel lash. Sometimes it's not something we check all the time on a roadside inspection, but if we're seeing wear or indications of damage to the steering, that's a good place to find that there is wear, especially in the gearbox itself, that you wouldn't visually see by checking the steering wheel lash. How much that wheel is going to turn before the steering starts to react. And depending on the diameter of your wheel, whether it's power steering or not, there's a table in the regulations that you're going to use to determine that. Clearly the output shaft should not be broken off at that particular point in time. As the driver told me, it just quit steering. I imagine it did. Frames. Frames can't be cracked, especially through the bottom flange. With a lot of the newer van type trailers, they're a unibody, or you might hear the term monocoque frame like in the motor coaches, where that entire body has to be intact because there are no frame rails. So damage to the upper bay, damage in the lower bay can lead to collapse of the trailer at that point in time. So you get that kind of damage, it's just a matter of time for that trailer actually collapses going down the road. And then you get the usual, well, never done that before. Which oddly enough is the same thing my grandpa said when his milk cow died. Never did that before. But we got to deal with it. Your fuel should not be going out on the ground, just in case you were wondering. That should be staying in your fuel lines. This particular individual, you can see the hole on the tank is actually very high up on the tank, and he had inexpertly used some JB weld to try to patch it and some duct tape to try to patch it. And it was just run down on the ground. And of course, the other thing he could have done was just simply not fill up that tank. That didn't occur to him either. And so I'm not sure what his operating expenses were on this particular truck or what his mileage per gallon was, but quite a bit of it was going on the road. As you can see, we got all the oil dry down. We even got to a point where we put down a plastic bucket because we were running out of oil dry. So, coupling devices. That's from a crash in Georgia. With the officer in Georgia that's a friend of mine sent me that picture. We were joking that we were going to invest in the company that made that lock for the Kingpin because it held onto the Kingpin and actually completely disconnected from the truck itself. That actually what you're seeing there is the lower fifth wheel assembly and should be on the tractor. But it held. It held. So impressed by the lock, not so impressed by the welds and the bolts on the tractor itself. Shouldn't have come off at that point in time. Parts and accessories can be just about anything. I mentioned that vehicle maintenance general, anything there's not a specific regulation on. If it's broken, it's cracked, it's not installed in a workmanlike manner. Obviously there is a regulation on springs themselves. Just a cool picture. Right? And then of course load securement. Okay? There's general load securement. We'll talk about load securement here in a little more in depth in a second. But basically the idea is it shouldn't be coming off your truck. Okay? This is kind of like the fuel. I'm not sure how much he paid for that gravel, but he paid for the gravel. And the state will chip and seal its own roads. We don't need you to be adding some gravel as you go down the road. So not a problem there. When we talk about load securement in general is broken down by two things, by weight and by length. Okay? We have to have chains for every 10 feet of length. If it's not braced up against something, we have to have 2 chains in the first 10 feet. By weight, the working load limit of the securement devices that we use have to meet or exceed half the weight of the load. So every time you get stopped for roadside inspection, they're going to be looking at least those 2 things. Do you have enough chains for length? Do you have enough chains for weight? When they look at those binders, they're going to look at the binder itself, the hooks, the chain, that whole thing, the old saying, the weakest link. That's what they're going to look at. They're going to look for those issues and what's the weakest link in that whole cargo securement device, and that's what we're going to give that for working load limit. So if you've got a chain rated for 10,000 pounds, but you've got a binder rated for 5, you're only going to get 5,000 pounds. Okay. I get questions about the ratchet type binders being required. They are not required. I would highly recommend them. It's easier to get the loads tight and retighten them. The old cam over style, I actually had a log driver, the chains were loose. And I said, hey, I need you to tighten up those chains before we get done with the inspection and before you take off down the road, and he's still not a problem. So he gets out a piece of pipe as a helper, and he's got the chain and he's trying to bring it down, but he's trying to get a little more length on that pipe. So he leans over, and I didn't see this because I was loading stuff on my car, and he's leaning over and he's sliding that pipe, and he slides it too far, and of course it pops up, catches him in the mouth. So first thing I hear is him yell, and I look up and he's standing in the driving lane of the road. His hat's in the passing lane, and he's got both hands on his mouth and blood running out of his mouth. And wow. So when I called it in, I said the driver had been hit in the mouth by a pipe, because he had. They thought I hit him in the mouth with a pipe. A whole lot of people showed up. Of course, the sad part was, I'm talking to the driver, we're getting an ambulance out there, and he says, man, I've done that before. You did it once and you lived? Come on, let's stop doing that. Let me for a Christmas present, I'm buying you ratchet binders. I'm gonna save your life here. So be careful with our binders. Direct versus indirect. Generally, when we're securing logs, it's always going to be what they call indirect attachment, meaning the binders themselves, the chains, are not attached to the load. They're actually holding the load onto the trailer. Hooked on one side, run to the other side. Direct attachment is when we're hauling equipment. When every time we have a bulldozer, we have a loader, whatever, anything that weighs more than 10,000 pounds, they have to have 2 binders or 2 attachments to the front, 2 to the rear. And those have to be directly attached to that piece of equipment. But when we do that, when we have that direct attachment, it cuts the working load limit in half. So you might actually add extra chains to make sure that piece of equipment is secure at that point in time. So we actually make you secure it in a way that's less effective. Excellent. Nothing wrong there, right? Nothing wrong there. We get into load specific. Obviously, when we're dealing with short wood or long wood, loaded crosswise or lengthwise, we have to have bunkers, bolsters, whatever you want to call them. Certain situations we have to have tie downs. They talk about have logs being in contact, the center of the highest log not being over the bunkers themselves. Those things that we're all familiar with. Going down the road, if it's a matter of taking an extra minute and throwing on an extra chain when you're not sure, you're going to be better off to throw on that extra chain. Because one of the things they're also going to look at is to make sure all the chains are in good shape. That there's no damage to that chain or no damage to that if you use any synthetic webbing, things of that nature. They're going to be watching that, looking for violations. Pole trailers, a little bit different for pole trailers. Obviously, you're not going to be able to necessarily secure them like you would anything else simply because of their design. So they have those particular regulations in there as well. Common sense is really the key, and more is better. Okay, more is better. Never going to get in trouble for having more chains than you needed. Okay? Now, if it's a bad chain that you throw on, the key is going to be: do you have enough chains that are good? Okay, and so if you may not realize you have a bad stretch of chain and you throw in an extra chain, when the officer comes and counts and says you need 6 chains, you've got 7 on there, but one of them's bad, so I take that out of the calculation, but you're still at 6. Okay? So, err on the side of caution. One thing I did want to touch on load securement is blocking and bracing. You have that, especially with pickup trucks and sighted vehicles. You'll get questions, and I've seen guys getting written up because they've got stuff in the bed of the truck that's sliding around. So things like your chainsaw, your oil, your other equipment. One of the keys to this blocking and bracing is when this stuff is sliding around in the back, is it going to adversely affect the stability or the maneuverability of the vehicle? If I've got a 3/4 ton pickup truck, nice 4-wheel drive truck, and I'm cruising down the road, it might not be doing my chainsaw any good to be sliding around in the back, but is that chainsaw sliding around going to cause anything to the stability of the vehicle? No, it's not going to be an issue. So you'll see roadside enforcement officers that get fired up. I used to hear them all the time say, I should be able to pick up this truck, turn it upside down, and nothing fall out of it. Well, in the federal regulations, it says normal operations. Generally speaking, picking trucks upside down and turning them, that's not normal operations. Okay? So that's what prevention against shifting or upon or within, but it has to be something. If you had a pallet of firewood and it's sliding around the bed of your pickup truck, yeah, that could affect your stability. But your chainsaw, your different equipment, not going to be an issue. Not going to be an issue. A broom, I've seen all kinds of crazy stuff getting written up. I've made fun of officers for writing it up, but I used to have a supply of Mickey Mouse ears that I would give in. So, yeah. Hours of service. Talking about maximum hours that I can drive, maximum hours that I can be on duty. Maximum hours I can drive are 11 hours. Okay? Since 2003, I've been able to drive 11 hours in a work day. Prior to 2003, I can only drive 10. Okay? However, in 2003, when we said you can drive 11, they also said you can only be on duty for 14. And on-duty time is going to include any sleeper berth time less than 8 hours and any off-duty time less than 10. So I take an hour meal break, that's going to count towards my 14 hours, even though I'm off duty. Okay? So that can actually shorten my day. The new meal break that we're going to talk about here in a second. If you're doing a logbook, you're actually only going to be able to work 13 and a half hours a day because the federal government's making you take a 30-minute break at some point in that day. Okay? So again, we're reducing productivity. Weekly hours, how many hours can I work in a week? I can be on duty, which is driving, and on duty not driving. Only those bottom 2 lines on the log. I can be on duty and not driving 70 hours in 8 days if I'm a 70-hour rule company, 60 hours in 7 days if I'm a 60-hour rule company. What's the difference? 70-hour rule company simply means that you have operations 7 days a week. Okay? Doesn't mean that you literally operate 365 days a year. It just means that you have operations. You may not work every Sunday, but you work Sundays. Okay? And if you only work 5 days a week or 6 days a week, then you'd be a 60-hour rule company. But you're counting less days. So there's really not a whole lot of difference there. Okay? And it's not really on the roadside. The officer's just going to ask your driver, are you a 60 or 70-hour rule company? What do you think they all say? 70. 70's more. 70 bigger than 60. 70. I'm a 70-hour rule driver. All right. Good enough. Logbooks. There are lots of exceptions to logbooks, and we're going to touch base on a couple of them here in a second. But basically speaking, if I'm driving down the road, I have my logbook, I'm tracking my hours that I work. How much have I been on duty? How much have I been off duty? Okay? Simple as that. Okay? Now those exceptions, and some of these are going to apply to you guys. First one, they refer to it as local driving or short haul exception. This is where we talk about the air mile radiuses. You've heard about the 100 air mile radius and the 150 air mile radius. If you are within a 150 air mile radius of your work reporting location, you start and end your day at that location, you don't have to do a logbook. Okay? Still can't drive more than 11 hours. If you're a 100 air mile radius driver, you can only work a 12-hour day. But if you're a 150 non-CDL driver, then you can actually work 14-hour days. You can get 2 16-hour days in a week if you want. Still subject to the 70-hour rule. The key is you're not carrying a logbook. You're doing a time record back at the shop. It could be a time card that I'm stamping. That could be a sheet of paper where I write the time I come in and the time I end my day every day back in the shop. Okay, it can be that simple. But that is an exception that's available. How many of you know guys that are using that local driving? And local driving can cross state lines. When you do that 150 mile radius circle of your work reporting location, if that takes you, that includes Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, you can run in all 3 of those states and be in that 150 mile radius. The other exception is agricultural exceptions, agricultural operations. They're exempt from the regulations, and we'll dig into that a little bit deeper here in another slide in a second. But there are some things that are going to exempt you from doing a logbook. And if you stay within your home state, often the way the states adopt federal regulations is they will exempt local drivers from the regulations as well, or maybe anything under 26,000. Oftentimes they'll exempt. It's a state-by-state thing. So you may not, even though we say you got to do a logbook, there are lots and lots of people that get exempted from doing a logbook. Idea behind the logbook: control how many hours you work, make sure you get a 10-hour break in between shifts so you get rested and you don't build up fatigue. It's really the key. Changes that have gone into effect: you can now rest in a parked commercial motor vehicle and log that as off-duty. Used to be that was on duty, not driving. With the way we count the 14-hour rule, that's not a huge change, but it is enough of a change that it won't affect your 70-hour rule now. So you can actually get a little power nap in the truck. Not going to be an issue there. Egregious violations are probably the biggest one. If you violate your logbook regulations by more than 3 hours, they can fine you civilly $11,000 for a carrier and $2,750 for a driver, just like cell phone. Okay. Again, I haven't heard anybody get hit with these fines, but they actually put that in there so they can. For all oil field operations, they changed recording time. What's going to affect you guys more are the changes that just went into effect July 1st of this year. First of all, the 34-hour reset. How many of you have heard of the 34-hour reset? It kicks in on the 70-hour rule. Okay? I can reset that 70-hour week by taking 34 hours off duty. Prior to July 1st, I could start that any time I wanted. Okay? Now, for my 34-hour block of time, it has to include 2 blocks of time from 1 to 5 a.m. In other words, 2 nights in a row, I need to be off duty from 1 to 5. The other one is the meal break, and this is causing a lot of heartache for the industry, or all industries, because now we're taking 30 minutes away from you. Once you have been on duty for 8 hours, you cannot drive unless you take a 30-minute break of off-duty time. Okay, we're forcing you to take a meal break. Okay? We want you to have a break in that day. So that's why I said anymore, you could be on duty for 14 hours, according to the logbook rules, but only get 13 and a half hours of working because we're going to make you take that 30-minute break. But that went into effect July 1st, and then by August 1st, they said this is not going to apply to short haul exception drivers. If you're in the 100 or 150 air mile radius exception driver and you're doing that time card, this regulation does not apply to you, which actually makes sense, because if you're doing a time card that shows the time you started and the time you ended, how the hell do I know you took a 30-minute break? All you have to say is, yes, I took a 30-minute break. Okay, you're not in violation. There's no documentation there, so it's ridiculous to have you comply to begin with. So they've actually taken that out. Again, sometimes common sense sneaks in. They try not to let it happen, but it happens from time to time. Agricultural operations. This is what I was talking about earlier. I was going to spend a little more time on. If you're within 150 air miles, that used to be 100, but with MAP 21, the new Federal Highway Reauthorization Bill, moving ahead for progress in the 21st century, we call it MAP 21. They changed that to make it 150 air miles because everything else to do with agriculture was 150 air miles. So if you're within 150 air miles, you're hauling commodities or supplies to or from a farm during planting and harvesting season, Part 395 does not apply. Now, planting and harvesting season is determined by each state. Now, some states, like Colorado, have very specific planting and harvesting seasons. They start on this date, they end on this date. Other states, like Indiana, we like simple. Planting and harvesting season is January 1st through December 31st of each year. It's always planting and harvesting season in Indiana. Okay, and I tell people it's because of the indoor grow operations for marijuana. You can be planting any time of the year. Okay. You can only plant corn, beans, and wheat and sorghum at certain times of the year, but marijuana can be planted 365 days a year. So Indiana, we made it 365. Now you want to be careful. I see I had down there state and local enforcement, be careful. And the reason I say this is because I have a friend with Washington State Patrol. And I was talking to him and I said, hey, you guys, Washington, lots of logs. I said, you treat that as a farm commodity, right? You give the log haulers the agriculture exemption because we do in Indiana. And he said, no. He said, they're like anybody else. Now, Oregon and California, I know, treat it as a farm commodity because I looked it up in their regulations. But you got to be careful with your different locations, especially you get an officer that's not familiar with the commercial motor vehicle regulations and thinks they know it. You may get written up at that point in time, and that's something that you would want to challenge. Okay, so just be careful of that. Be aware that you're dealing with local officers sometimes that aren't necessarily up on the regulations. When you're crossing state lines, if it's interstate, then the federal regulations trump state law. at that point in time. I can't say in Indiana that you can't haul logs without wearing a pink shirt and enforce that if you're an interstate carrier. I can only enforce that on Indiana carriers that operate within Indiana. There's limitations on that. But that doesn't mean you might not catch that officer that thinks that, hey, I can hit these guys. No, they're interstate. Only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. Only federal regulations, they trump everything. Okay? And sometimes they have to spell that out from time to time because the states will still try to drag people back in. But be careful with that. Just be careful. Okay? Perfectly good truck, right? By gosh, let's load it up with pulpwood and take it on down the road. Let's talk about maintenance. Got to do maintenance files on our trucks. We have to have identifying information in those files. Basically, the idea is we want to know what truck we're dealing with. We need to know what maintenance we've done and what maintenance is coming up, what oil changes, tire rotations, etc. That we need to track all that. We have to do an annual inspection on our trucks once a year at least. We need to have an inspection done on the truck so we know that's in good shape. And we need to copy that inspection or decal on the truck, and then we need to have a copy in our maintenance file that we're going to keep in our office. Okay? And it's a copy of the periodic inspection. It's a J.J. Keller. It's pretty much a standard form that's used. Probably looks similar to those that have seen them. And then at the end of the day, I was talking about pre and trip inspection reports earlier. At the end of the day, you have to do your driver vehicle inspection report. And that's anything that you found on your pre-trip or anything that the driver has discovered during the day has to go in that driver vehicle inspection report. They fill it out, turn it into the company. You need to take corrective action on anything they found wrong, and then you have to keep it for 90 days. Okay? Now, having said all that, they just came out with a proposed rulemaking on the driver vehicle inspection report to change it so that the only time a driver is required to fill out that driver vehicle inspection report is if they find something wrong with the truck. Okay? Now, how many times is a driver ever going to find anything wrong with a truck? For the most part, they pencil whip them now. They just fill them out, sign a date because they have to do them. The passenger carriers will still have to fill them out, but your property carriers, pretty much the DVR is going to go by the wayside. Okay? Be very little to enforce there. But it hasn't gone into effect yet, so don't go back and say, guys, good news. Stop filling out those reports. Still have to do them for right now, and still have to be able to produce those for the federal government if they come in. And a lot of times on the back of a logbook, if the guys are filling out a logbook, that's going to be the form right there. And you can actually buy books of just driver vehicle inspection reports. Again, like with so many things, as long as it has the minimum information, it can be any form that you put together. You can make up your own driver vehicle inspection report and print those out or make photocopies. It's entirely up to you. You don't have to use something that's pre-published. Okay? So you have a Class A, it's going to be the heavy truck with a trailer. Class B is going to be a heavy truck by itself, or the small trailer. Class C license is going to be, I talked about that car with the oxygen placards. Okay? That's going to be a Class C license. Any endorsements that we have to have are going to be determined by what we're hauling, hazardous materials, passengers, or by the type of vehicle we're driving, school bus, doubles or triples. Okay? Just a word of warning, if you're going to make a fake CDL license, don't use the picture of you and your girlfriend at the mall. Okay? Just throwing it out there. It's a good picture. It's a good picture. But it's kind of what we call a clue in enforcement. Might not be an actual valid license. So CDL, everything else kicks in at 10. Logbooks, medical cards, maintenance files, all that stuff kicks in at 10,000 pounds. CDL kicks in at 26, and so does drug and alcohol testing. Okay? That kicks in at 20. If I have to have a CDL to drive the truck, I'm subject to drug and alcohol testing, which means I'm subject to a pre-employment test. You have to test me for drugs before you allow me to drive, and you have to get a negative result back. I have to be in a random testing program. I have to test at least 50% of my drivers for drugs and 10% for alcohol every year. I have to do reasonable suspicion training for supervisors. Okay? I have to do post-crash testing. Okay? I have to do return to duty testing if I test positive. A whole bunch of testing we have to do there. I have to do follow-up testing. And we have to have a policy. Okay? And they're required to give that to new employees so they understand what the consequences are of their actions and what we're going to be testing for. And throw your empties away. Don't keep those between the seats of the truck, especially if you're going to back into the strip club across from the truck stop when you're intoxicated. Okay? Would again be a bad thing. So what's the impact of all these regulations? We're talking about 390, 391, 392, and these things you have to do, these things that you can't do. We need to talk about the impact. What happens on the side of the road? Or in this case, what happens when a four-wheel drive F-150 meets the truck that was hauling that load of logs in the background, in an intersection. Okay? Well, we're going to get a roadside inspection at that point in time. And roadside inspection is going to be one of 3 levels. Level 1 is everything: driver, vehicle. The officer's going to get underneath it, check the brakes, the frames, the whole kit and caboodle. Level 2 is a walk-around inspection, and a level 3 is a paperwork inspection. Just looking at the paperwork for the truck and the driver. Okay, quick roadside inspection. One of 3 things is going to happen from that inspection. I'm going to do my inspection. I'm going to find nothing that's listed in that green book, in that Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. No violations. It's excellent. It's a clean inspection. You're going to go home. You're going to head on down the road to a clean inspection. Second possibility is I find things wrong with the truck, okay, but they're not out of service. Or I find things wrong with the driver. So I'm going to write those up on the inspection report. And I'm going to upload that information. That's going to go into the CSA program. Okay? It's going to go into the CSA program. CSA is fed by roadside inspections. And then anything I find wrong with the driver of the truck has to be corrected before we send that driver and truck back out, okay? Before we dispatch. The third option is we find violations and they are out of service violations. They're in that small spiral bound book that's going around. And at that point in time, if it's a driver, then the driver is going to be placed out of service until those violations are corrected. And if it's a vehicle, the vehicle is going to be shut down until those violations are corrected. The other thing is in the CSA program, when we talk about scores, there's actually increased weight for an out-of-service violation. Okay? And we'll talk about CSA here in a second. But these roadside inspections are going to feed the CSA program. That's where all the information comes in CSA. Tickets don't feed into CSA, warnings don't feed into CSA, only the inspection reports themselves. Okay? So CSA, at this point in time, replaced the SafeStat system. Okay, have you heard the SafeStat system? It's one of the older systems that went into effect in December 2010. It's updated monthly, and it uses information provided by the federal government, by enforcement, those inspections that we were just talking about. And that triggers the intervention process, the audits and the compliance reviews that we're going to talk about. Basic scoring, all crashes and inspection reports feed into the CSA system. Like I said, no tickets or warnings. A severity weight is assigned for a violation. A paperwork violation on your logbook would be a severity weight of 1. A load securement violation would be a severity weight of 9. It's a 1 to 10 score. The higher the score, obviously the worse. The newer the violation, there's a time weight that number gets multiplied by. They have a whole algorithm worked out for all the different violations that feed into the system. No new information is being collected. Okay? It's just being handled differently. And the way it's being handled are in the 7 basics. If you pull up your CSA score on the CSA website, you're going to have an unsafe driving score, fatigue driving, driver fitness, controlled substance, vehicle maintenance, cargo related. Now, cargo related got changed, crash indicator. Now, last December, cargo related got changed to hazardous materials. Cargo related had been hazmat and load securement. Load securement got moved into maintenance, and hazardous materials now stands alone on its own. Okay? So if you look at that and you're thinking, boy, I don't remember this hazardous material entry, it's because they changed that last year. So those audits are fed off the CSA system. When you have those basics, if you get your scores get too high, you hit an alert status on one of those categories, then that's going to trigger the audit process. They call it the intervention process. Sounds better than audit, right? So the intervention process, there are 2 different types of interventions, 2 different types of audits. You have safety audits. If you're a new company, then you're going to get a safety audit. It's either going to be a pass or fail, and that's now going to take place in the first 12 months that you were in operation. There are 16 automatic failures that were added in 2009, because there weren't enough people failing as far as Congress was concerned. Okay, it was supposed to be an educational program. They were educating carriers, not enough people were failing, so let's increase the failure rate. The other audits we're going to run into are going to be called compliance reviews. And these are where a state or federal officer is going to come in. They're triggered by scores on your CSA, they're triggered by crashes, and they're triggered by complaints, specific and verifiable complaints they can come in on. They can be focused or full review. Focused means we're going to look at one category. Your logbooks are bad, so we're going to look at just logbooks. Full reviews, we're going to look at everything. Okay? And they're going to come up with a safety fitness determination. You're going to get a score. And your score is either going to be satisfactory, it's going to be conditional, or it's going to be unsatisfactory. And if you get an unsatisfactory, 60 days later, you're going to get a cease and desist order. Okay? They're going to send you an order to shut down. They give you 60 days to make corrections, get those submitted to them, and you can sometimes get an upgrade to conditional with a review like that, and avoid the cease and desist order. Okay? But an unsatisfactory rating would be bad. They're going to look at all aspects of your operation at that point in time. A focused review, if they come in and just look at one category, that's not actually rated. The only time they'll rate it is they come in and look at everything that they're going to deal with at that point. Okay? And it may result in fines, especially if you get an unsatisfactory, you are probably going to be fined. And fines are based on the gross revenue of the company. Obviously, we wouldn't fine you like we would fine Walmart. But we have to find Walmart at a higher level to get their attention. So they're going to base it on the gross vehicle rating, or the gross revenue of the company, the gross rating of the company. We talk about roadside inspections, we talk about DOT audits, but this is what you don't want to be in. Because when you get involved in a roadside crash, this is, it's hard to see it, but that pickup truck is in between the tractor and the trailer, and the load of logs that is now all over this county road. Okay. With the bad chains and the oil-soaked brakes and the cracked frame, gross vehicle weight for a load of logs in Indiana is 80,000 if it's coming out of the field. In other words, it hasn't been weighed or titled. You get a 10% tolerance in Indiana. So 88,000 is the maximum gross, 109,000. 109, and ran a stop sign with bad brakes. Okay. At that point in time, all bets are off. Your insurance, we were talking about insurance earlier, and the investigators, and they're looking for stuff that's wrong. They're looking for stuff that's wrong. So it's not just a criminal act at that point in time, and the prosecutor's dealing with now, you're also dealing with civil, with the family sue, and the insurance companies get involved. And they are looking for anything. They're looking for anything. Okay. Going to open up for questions. Do want to thank Husqvarna. I'm going to hang around for a while, so if we can move right along. But I'll be in the back of the room, and then after things wrap up, I'll be available for questions. Like I said, we've got some pamphlets up here if you want to contact the company. I've got business cards, so by all means, feel free to ask questions.